Contribution margin problem 2. Fruity Pebbles Apparel sells fruit-themed shirts at $46 per shirt. It incurs monthly fixed costs of $4,000. The contribution margin ratio is calculated to be 30%. What is the variable cost per shirt? So we're determining the variable cost per shirt. Now, variable costs, we could be doing many different things. We could be given the total production costs, so you might be solving that using fixed costs. Here, we're given the contribution margin ratio. Contribution margin ratio. And the idea here is just remembering the formula. Contribution margin ratio is contribution margin over sales. So you're saying, okay, well, what's that have to do with variable costs? Think about it. What is contribution margin? Contribution margin is sales minus variable costs. So if we know the contribution margin ratio is 30%, and we have fixed costs of $4,000, and we know the shirts sell at $46 per unit, we can determine the variable cost, which is the question here, the variable cost per shirt. Now, the fixed cost, we can ignore that for this question. That's not going to help us because as you can see in the contribution margin ratio formula right here, nothing relates to fixed costs. So we can eliminate that information. We can ignore it. It's not important to our calculation. It would be important in something else if we're looking at total production costs or something like that, but we're not looking at that. We're looking at solving for variable costs given contribution margin ratio. We are given $46 per unit per shirt, I should say, per unit. So we can go ahead and use that information. So contribution margin over $46. We're looking for the contribution margin per unit or per shirt because it's $46 per unit or per shirt. And if we solve for that, so if we take our sales minus our variable costs, and the contribution margin ratio is 30%, is all over sales, we can solve for this. So $46 per unit minus variable costs, we'll call that X, that's variable costs, all over $46 gives us 30%. So again, we're solving for X. If we can solve that. Now this looks like algebra. It is algebra. There are many different ways to look at this algebraically. You might be better, more gifted at math, however you want to solve for this now that I've set it up. But I like to kind of break it down to help you understand better. The way I like to see this is contribution margin over $46, which is the sales, equals 30%. So that means that the contribution margin is 30% of the sales amount because this number, contribution margin over $46, that calculation equals 30%. And again, another way to write that, and you can use algebra to solve this, but the way I like to think of it, just thinking about how fractions are set up, the contribution margin number on the top divided by 46 will equal 30% or 0.3. So we can take the $46 sales price and we can multiply that by 30%, and that means contribution margin will equal $13.80. Let me rewrite it to show you. So again, contribution margin over $46, I know I wrote it a lot, equals 30%. And again, we just used our calculation over here of $46 sales price times 30% to get $13.80. So if we take $13.80 over $46, you will get 30%. Now we're not done. The answer is not $13.80. We're solving for variable costs. Now we know that contribution margin equals sales minus variable costs. If we know contribution margin is going to be $13.80, we just solve for that, $13.80, and we know the sales price, so $13.80, we know the sales price per unit, these are all per unit, is $46 per unit, as we're told in the facts up here at the top, $46 per unit, then we can solve for the variable cost, which we're trying to determine by taking variable costs equal $46 minus $13.80. So variable costs equal $32.20. And that is how we get variable costs. And we have just completed this problem. So what is a variable cost? Variable costs here are $32.20 per shirt or per unit. And again, the way we did this, we were given the contribution margin ratio of 30%. Knowing the contribution margin ratio is contribution margin over sales, we can determine our variable cost because contribution margin is sales minus variable costs, and we're given the sales price. And since we know the contribution margin ratio, we basically know all the elements here except the variable costs. So we start by setting contribution margin ratio equal to 30%, and then we don't know the contribution margin because we don't know variable costs, but we know the denominator is $46 per unit. To get the contribution margin, we take the $46 sales amount and we multiply that by 30% because we know the denominator is $46. We know the amount, the percentage contribution margin ratio is 30%. So by multiplying that, we get our contribution margin of $13.80. Now that we know sales price is $46 per unit, contribution margin is $13.80 per unit, we can then solve for our variable cost, which we did down here. And then by doing that, we get $32 per unit, and boom, $32 per unit per shirt. That is the variable cost per unit.